Okay, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are watching from us from. And on behalf of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and the Water Policy Center, it gives me a great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, chair, and the participants who have joined this session. As you know, this conference has started on 29th August, 3 days before. And we are glad that you could join us today at this nice and WPC International Conference on the post-pandemic world order, navigating the new normal. And today, as the last and the third day of the conference, which was inaugurated on 29th August by Foreign Minister of Nepal, Pradeep Gaivali, and Dr. Abdullah Rashid Ahmed from the State Minister of Maldives and other high dignitaries. And since last 3 days, more than 150 speakers and experts from different 30 countries have joined us and deliver their research and their presentation, and they share their thoughts. And this is the last session of this 3-day event. It is the 30th session and the last session of this conference. And to chair this session, I would like to invite, or I would like to introduce Dr. Mahfuz Kabir with us today. It is my great pleasure to introduce him. Dr. Mahfuz Kabir is a research director at the Bangladesh Institute of International and Strategic Studies, Dhaka. He holds a PhD in economics from School of Economics and Finance, Curtin University, Australia. His areas of research interest include labor market, social development, social protection, macroeconomics issues, climate change, budget, disaster, and risk management. As a professional economist, he is intensively involved in the research and teaching for more than 19 years at various levels. He conducted a number of household surveys and quantitative research in various projects funded by the Inter Alia, World Bank, UNDSC, UNDP, and UN CTD, USAID, UNICEF. There are many international well-known and renowned institutions which funded the research projects conducted by Dr. Kabir, like Asia Foundation as well. So we have very we can say distinguished, very expert and very well-known scholar to chair this session. Without extending this introduction, I call Dr. Mahfuz Kabir to take charge and chair the session. Dr. Kabir, it's to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for a nice introduction. So basically, even though I'm an economist, but I have been working with this institute for the last 16 years. So, and our institute, as you already mentioned, Bangladesh Institute of International Strategic Studies, especially conducts research and deliberation on definitely traditional security issues and non-traditional security, international studies. In fact, the strategic studies, peace and conflict studies. So we have a lot of, in fact, areas that we do research, and this very seminar and particularly this session that covers a lot of traditional and non-traditional security issues, that also covers the areas of interest and work of our institute as well. So and from that, in fact, experience and background, I think I would be able to understand what the speakers, our distinguished speakers today, speak on in their presentation, and definitely I also hope that I will be able to contribute with my brief remark after the presentations. So without much ado, and definitely I would like to thank Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and NICE for inviting me to chair this very important session, and I'll be also benefiting from the enlightening presentation by the distinguished speakers today. So without further ado, I would like to invite our presenters today, and our first speaker is Ladhu Ram Chaudhary. He is an assistant professor, Department of Political Science, University of Rajasthan, India, and his topic of the presentation is the impact of COVID-19 on the notion of power in the international relations. So to Professor Choudhury.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chair Dr. Kabir Saab. Thank you so much, Dr. Pramod Jaswal and his team and the Center for Water Policy for giving me this opportunity. It's really a wonderful academic exercise to learn, to get new ideas, and to get ourselves from intellectual wealth. Today, I would like to present my paper titled as The Impact of COVID-19 on the Notion of Power in International Relations. And in this paper, I would like to highlight the fundamental question which I'm seeking to investigate and to answer is this: does COVID-19 made any fundamental change in notion of power in international relations? And if so, to what extent and of what kind? The aim is what is the implication of this changing notion of power, if any, on the post-pandemic world order? To investigate these questions, my central hypothesis or the argument is that COVID pandemic has diversified existing notions of power in multiple dimensions. In fact, it forced nations to find out new strategies, mechanisms, goals, and means to wield power and exercise power. In this connection, COVID-19 has made the power politics more prominent in international politics, but at the same time, it has made power politics more challenging for the nations. To analyze this argument and to reflect on it, my presentation is basically divided in two parts. The first half of the presentation, I would like to discuss the evolution of notion of power in IR as a discipline and IR as a practicing institution. And then I will put or test the impact of COVID in conceptual theoretical framework. So as we know that power is a central currency of international politics. It's a centrifugal force which drives international politics. Any nation, whether it is a small or a great, or is a middle power or a weak state or a rogue state or a responsible state, every state's foreign policy objective is to seek power to maximize power. That is what is a conventional wisdom of IR tells us. But at the same time, the literature tells it or informs us is that power remains contested concept. Contested in the sense it has not been successfully defined, or it has not been agreed on what actually it constitutes. It also remains an ambiguous concept, ambiguous in sense of its practice, sense of its use, sense of its impact, as well it remains situational. Sometimes some things works as a tool of power, and with the time and space, that particular tool of power becomes powerless. So it has been seen in the history and the discourse on IR that power as a concept remains contested, ambiguous, and it is a situational concept. What has been agreed is a very simple definition, is by Robert Dahl. This is this I'm quoting: power is generally defined as A get A can get B to do something that B would otherwise not do. So any mechanism, any capability, any ability, or any tool in the hand of A can force or can attract or can seduce a actor B to do something which is not B is willing to do, or otherwise B is not ready to do. So this is simplified definition of power. Does anything change with the COVID or this pandemic era? To analyze this, let's discuss what are the key aspects of power as a concept, power as a theoretical concept. Power generally is understood in two ways. One is material attributes of power, which is actually defined as, or understood as, the elements of national power. And the second is relational attributes of power, and which is basically the behavioral impact that power makes on certain actors. So the material or capability driven concept of power is actually defined by realist school of international relations, especially Morgenthau, E.S. Carr, and others. And the relational attributes of power actually drawn from Robert Dell's definition of power, and then further it was developed by David Baldwin and others. So as international relations as a discipline evolved, the discourse on power has also evolved. During interwar periods and early Cold War, the focus was much more on the material capabilities or national elements approach of power. Later on, as behavioralism in political science and other disciplines emerged, the behavioral or relational aspect or approach of power has been used in international relations. So basic difference between these two approaches, one approach is dominated by the capabilities, is limited with the capabilities. Other approach is limited with the abilities. And further, this has been, as it evolved, it has become more contested and more conflicting or ambiguous. For example, Stephen Luke, in his article, Radical View of Power, defines three important dimensions of power. And then, international relations theorist Joseph Nye has elaborated the concept of power in IR in terms of soft power, hard power, and smart power. And then there is other aspects of power. For example, power has been seen in terms of various factors, such as in terms of influence, power defined as a part of force or coercion or attraction, and there are so other various forms of power, including these evolutionary trajectory. David Baldwin, in his book Power and International Relations 2016, has arrived to flag out 6 important perspectives on power, especially in domain of international relations, where he says the first aspect or first perspective of power is power as identity. We have seen that there's an identity associated with every state in international system, and that identity actually tells the relative capability of the state in the international system, relative position of the state in the international system. So for example, saying that state A is great power, saying that state B is a rogue state, saying that state C is a weak state, it's actually the power that determines the identity of the state. Here I would like to say that the COVID actually complicated the status of great powers in international system. Why it is so? Because due to COVID and the responses that we have seen from the various states to counter the pandemic, we find that great powers has abdicated their responsibility to handle the problems associated with the pandemic. They have been seen to blame each other rather than showing the willingness to tackle this global problem. Whereas some relatively weaker states has emerged as new power centers in global politics as they have performed better in terms of countering and managing the pandemic. For example, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and some other small nations, due to their robust healthcare system, they have given a new light to the world to deal with the pandemic. So here, the power and identity actually becomes some kind of complications with that power associated identity in the international system. Then second, David Baldwin is talking about power as a good. Now we have seen that international politics is a struggle for power. And there's a fantastic debate between Kenneth Walsh and John Mearsheimer on what states wants to seek, what is the state's ultimate goal. Walsh says that ultimate goal of the states is to seek security, maximize security, whereas Mearsheimer disagrees, says the ultimate goal of states to maximize power. And if we see these debates and relate it with the COVID, we find that states' goal, such as making militarily powerful states or getting more military strength, economic welfare, and or health infrastructure or education. What is most important? So here, if you see that COVID is giving something new in terms of goals of the states. Earlier, it was in a conventional understanding, it was seen as that getting economic mightiness or getting more military power was considered as to maximize power and ultimate goal of the state. Due to COVID, in the COVID context, we see that building a robust health infrastructure becomes the critical goal and critical symbol of acquiring power or becoming powerful. Then third, David Baldwin is saying that there are, the third is power as means. Power as actually defined in terms of means. Power is something which states use to attain their goals, to obtain their goals, and to become more secure for national security and national interest. Power is something used as a means. There are multiple tactics and strategies to secure and to get power. So in the traditional understanding, military strength is used as it's recognized as a standard of political values. But here, in the COVID context, we find that military strength cannot deal with the current enemy, which is COVID-19, which is a virus. So whether we can deal through the military means, can we deal through the force, can we deal through the economic strength? Here, the means of power becomes some other factors. For example, acquiring vaccines or sustaining and reinforcing social distance becomes means of power, because how long you can sustain lockdown, because that's how, if a country can sustain lockdown for longer period, it means they have more power in their hand. If they cannot, then the power as means becomes very limited. Military use, military strength and military force becomes very limited. Next, uh, David Baldwin is saying that power as mechanisms. Uh, Power is actually understood in IR as a kind of mechanism, for example, balance of power. Now, balance of power uh, is a kind of mechanism where states acquire resources and make alliance in the international system. Here, I would like to underline that due to COVID, the balance of power has become in the state of flux, because who is your alliance, who is your enemy, where to ally, on what kind of resources to mobilize, it becomes very, ambiguous situation. And the fifth characteristics of power in the Baldwin schema of things is power as competition, where states compete in international system, and the competition normally seen as a zero-sum game between the states, because one state's gain is other state's loss. But when we see the COVID and its responses, or what kind of responses it demands from the international community, we find that COVID has forced and it demands the states to cooperate and collaborate rather than compete. If they compete with their own narrow national interest, they will not be, the global community, international, at international level, they will not be able to counter this. And finally, he says that power has capabilities, where he says that when we say somebody is having power, means somebody is capable of doing something. For example, capable of winning a war, or capable of winning a guerrilla war, or capable of being an economic independent country. Here, we see that COVID has actually exposed nations' actual capabilities and potential to survive from unpredictable threats and uncertain risks, because those who have been seen has been seen as a global power centers, they are also facing some kind of situation as the countries of third world. So whether they was really capable power centers or not, that is actually in question. So in sum,
Professor Chaudhary,
yes.
I understand that you have a lot of things to say, but unfortunately, we need to manage the time. So I'd be happy if you summarize your points and then end your presentation in 2 minutes.
I will just take 2 minutes, if you permit me. Or should I stop now and then we can, I can answer in the question answer session?
No, you take 2 minutes and summarize your points.
So in sum, I would like to say that COVID-19 adds some novelty to the evolution of notion of power. Because number one, it adds, it makes the physical assets of power as less influential. In relational terms, it demands for more collaboration and cooperative strategies between the states rather than domination and coercion. And there are certain new instruments of power. For example, developing a robust healthcare system or a global healthcare governance system, as well as now the health issue has become more prominent issue in the realm of international security and national security rather than building military. So it has compelled nations to change their political and economic goals. It has altered the relationship and process of interstate actions. And therefore, I would say that it has diversified probable responsible of nations towards a common threat. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I don't see any kind of comments or questions to the speaker right now, but if it comes, then you will get the chance to respond. So now we have the next presenter, Ms. Saim Mukhtar, PhD candidate, Department of Political Science, University of in the USA, and her title of the presentation is Migration and Demography in the South Asia. So even though the title doesn't touch upon the issue of COVID, but I think her presentation will also, in fact, touch this cross-cutting issue, I'd say. So over to you, Saim Mukhtar.
Thank you, respected Chair Dr. Kabir, and my distinguished co-panelists. Can you all hear me clearly? Okay. So as Dr. Kabir pointed out, firstly, a big thank you to NIIC Nepal and the Water Policy Center and the team. As Dr. Kabir pointed out, today I'll be speaking on migration and demography in South Asia, and that I will do in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Firstly, I will talk a bit about the impact on domestic migrants in the region. Then about the international migrants from South Asia and the disruption in remittances, and in the end about the impact of the virus in terms of demography on different segments of the population in South Asia. South Asia has some of the highest population densities in the world, particularly in urban areas, and that makes the people further susceptible to the spread of the virus. The lockdowns ordered by the South Asian governments to combat the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically reversed the rural to urban migrant flows. It was now urban to rural migrant flows. The sudden announcement of these lockdowns in South Asian countries, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, created a big chaos as domestic migrants, having lost their jobs in the cities, scrambled to get back to their states, their towns and villages, which exacerbated the crowding and made enforcement of social distancing impossible. In fact, millions of domestic migrants were affected across South Asia, and there were mass migrations back to their home districts. Sadly, many of them even went by foot. We all saw these news in the media. These migrants faced a very difficult choice. It was between starving in the urban cities without work or long and potentially fatal journeys for some of them over hundreds of miles back to their homes. So with that, the flow of remittances from the urban migrants back to their rural families has also dried up. Economic difficulties in the cities have actually increased the difficulties in the towns and the villages, as much needed income support from remittances has plunged. The migrants arrived back in the villages and towns, adding burdens to the community struggling to support themselves. The lockdown impacted the livelihoods of millions of internal migrant workers in South Asia. They were working as daily wage and informal sector workers, such as construction workers, transport workers, and domestic workers, workers employed in the apparel sector, which has resulted in economic distress for their families in rural communities. The harsh reality of inequality and often poor infrastructure development in South Asia means the exclusion of internal migrants from access to several services, including healthcare. They also have less access to sanitary practices and are more vulnerable to spikes in food prices. Also, social distancing can be difficult to implement for them. All these aspects which are very much prevalent right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then there are, of course, also the international migrants, the remittances sent by whom are an important source of income for households in South Asia, and foreign exchange. And owing to the pandemic, there have been disruptions in the flow of remittances. World Bank has projected that remittances to South Asia would decline by 22% in 2020 due to loss of jobs and falling wages of migrant workers in the host countries induced by COVID-19. And also the collapse of crude oil prices that affect economic activity in the Gulf countries. Severe recession in developed economies such as the US, the UK, and European countries has also rendered many migrant workers jobless. The development impacts, if we see, on migrant families and communities in terms of the remittance supported nutrition, health, education, and income outcomes will be severely affected. A large number of students from South Asia study in universities in Europe, in the US, Australia, etc. These international students have also been affected by closure of university campuses, loss of student jobs, and mobility restrictions by both the origin and destination countries being hit by COVID-19. In South Asia, the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 is much more severe, given the vast proportions of population living at the margins. Inequalities will widen as women, vulnerable, and marginal groups are affected more adversely. The impact of COVID-19 is magnified for women, slum dwellers, older persons, persons living with disabilities, migrant workers, children, and youth. The high density of households in the urban slums reduces the efficacy of social distancing measures and increases exposure to the risk of COVID. Women are disproportionately affected by the pandemic in terms of income loss, increased burden of unpaid care work, higher exposure risks due to overrepresentation of women in healthcare, in garment industry, and due to elevated levels of gender-based violence, among others. School closures due to the pandemic could aggravate inequalities in learning outcomes, as the children belonging to disadvantaged sections are unable to use remote learning or distance learning tools due to the digital divide in the region. Older persons and persons with disabilities are more vulnerable to COVID infections. Social distancing is leading to their increased isolation and social exclusion, undermining their mental and physical health. Rising food insecurity could affect health conditions. The disruptions in the food supply chains that we've seen due to transport restrictions have the potential to cause malnutrition and food insecurity with long-term impacts on health outcomes, especially of women and children. Closure of schools has also denied children of poorer households access to midday meals, which could have adverse effects on nutrition. The disruptions in education and learning after the closure of schools and universities across most South Asian countries can have potential medium and long-term consequences on the quality of education and adverse impacts on the recruitment or hiring prospects of youth. People belonging to different vulnerable groups, such as girls, children of migrant workers, and refugees and youth, risk being more severely affected. Despite tremendous increase in access and coverage of digital services in South Asia, significant gaps exist in access and ownership of mobile phones and the internet between countries, among households, and between rural and urban populations, men and women, and between persons with and without disabilities. With this, I'll end it here so that the other panelists also get time. I can take any questions later. Thank you, Dr. Kabir.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have the presenter, Vinita Verma. Is a research scholar at Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, and her title of the presentation is The Strategic Importance of the Arctic Region. role of great powers amid COVID-19 fight. So it's a very interesting presentation. So Arctic is becoming an area of interest of the great powers, so that we understand from the recent discussions and in fact news in the media. So I'd like to invite Varma to present her paper.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair. Nice to see you and pleasure to have you in board. And thanks to the Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and ISC, NICE, Water Policy Center for inviting me here with such an academic expert in international relations. My topic is the strategic importance of the Arctic region, role of great powers amid COVID fight. So my topic, I'm trying to analyze the pandemic in my topic, where I will divide my topic in three sub-themes, where firstly, I will introduce by saying that what is the introduction, how it is important, and secondly, what is the area beneficial, why it is beneficial to the great powers, and how, thirdly, the how pandemic impacted the development in the Arctic. So as we all know, the Arctic is in the North Pole of the world, very limited area by Arctic Circle, located in the north altitude. So the region includes the North American countries, European countries, mostly vast land is covered by the Russian territory. And the main issues, I'm directly covering the issues. The first one is the climate change. They result in the rising temperature, which lead to the shrinking of ice sheet and then the potential release of methane. Because of release of methane, there is more increase in global warming and then the climate change in atmosphere, and it also harmful for the atmosphere, as we all know. It also change in vegetation and eventually leading to the destruction of the habitat of animals. And also the tribes which are living there for many years, who are actually impacting by the emerging businesses there. So the rise of sea level in other areas also increasing, eventually change in the global ocean in current pattern and circulation. The second is new territorial claims for resources. Due to the shrinking of ice sheet, new water bodies are emerging, and due to the surrounding countries of Arctic Ocean, they have started claiming these water bodies to harvest the resources and exploiting the resources. To exploit resources that are present there, especially the undiscovered and which are discovered already, and the many amount of oil and gas which are there is actually not discovered, and the great powers are actually going to there for great competition for oil and natural gas. Third is the new trade routes. Third issue is basically come due to the all above scenarios which I discussed earlier. There is a new facility because of clear water, that is shortening of trade routes. Free access of water bodies is allowed in international waters, but due to the territorial claims of countries are emerging, there will be no free access. Melting Arctic ice has opened shipping routes, the Northern Passage, which connected the Canada and the Northern Sea route. In warmer months, ships are starting to use the Northern Sea route, but that bypasses the Singapore, unlike the Suez route earlier. And due to this shortened path, businesses will be profitable as the cost of transporting will be less. And that is why there is so many strategic interests there which are earlier hidden because of the nobody cares that area as the like that it is there, and nobody cares, okay, there's a North Pole, but nobody ever thought of these issues, and which are emerging now. And now one can relate how the geographical or an environmental issue has turned out to be a geopolitical concern and economic concern here. And the fourth one is the Arctic Circle countries do not have a treaty to define their claims. Arctic Council is there where member countries discuss their issues. There are 8 countries, member countries, on their agenda is to promote, cooperate, interact among themselves and the indigenous communities and the inhabitants of this area. So these are the four main issues and how these impacted the area. Now, the Russia nowadays is claiming several 100,000 square kilometers of seabed as part of their continental shelf, a claim which overlaps with the similar claims of both earlier Canada and Denmark had done. The US refuses to recognize any territorial claims over parts of Arctic, arguing out these waters are international sea and open for navigation by any country. So now Russia came in part, and in 2007, it planted a titanium Russian flag at 14,000 feet depth to claim an extended continental shelf. On January 2015, US President Barack Obama set up an executive steering committee to plan and steer a US naval maritime project for the Arctic. So if one takes Arctic separately, which has all the rich resources in it, one can ask what kind of a frontier Arctic would be: an economic source or ecological preserve, or we can preserve environment, or we can take more and more economic benefit from there, or strategic point of view. So these all are interconnected in this area. So it may then lead to either international cooperation or a military or political confrontation. These issues were neglected in the past. However, they have now assumed importance in the wake of changing dynamics of the geopolitics in the Arctic region. Arctic Council, which promotes sustainable development in the Arctic by involving the indigenous communities of the member countries, is proving ineffective in the face of the rising geopolitical competition in this region. So the political geography of the Arctic is both complicated and yet unique at the same point, as 4 out of 5 main Arctic nations, except Russia, are the members of the US-led NATO. The two superpowers of the Cold War time, USA and Russia, are geographically very close to each other in the Arctic region. The US continues to maintain many defense facilities there. There is an ongoing struggle for control over the Arctic between US and Russia. These are the two main great powers. This new Cold War, as some international pundit has already told, that this is a new Cold War emerging there, has led to the US to maintain strong military presence in the region, as it lagged behind very much in the Cold War after the end of the Cold War period, as we will discuss later on, that how it lagged behind from Russia, that Russia almost have 42 to 43. I can surely say that they have the icebreakers there, and they have many Arctic scientific and military ports there. But US has started saying this effect after Russia has already maintained its military and economics were there, and after so many years it started emerging like, oh, Russia has already came here and now we lag behind, and China also emerging. So as the region of the Arctic seems to hold a significant portion of undiscovered energy resource of the world, energy development in this region is crucial to meet growing global demand. So the US seeks to ensure that the energy development throughout the Arctic occurs in an environmental sound manner, taking into account the interests of indigenous and local communities, as well as open and transparent market principles. There are some who believe that there is some 13% of undiscovered oil and 30% of natural gas is found in the Arctic region, as CRS reports September 2019. So the geographical, environment, economic realities are realizing new geopolitical surges in the Arctic region. Russia claims a major area. US has enormous reserve of oil in the water of Alaska. Alaska is the main part there in the Arctic North Pole. Very expensive. It is very expensive to reach there because of the route there. US have to cover the, Canada and then reach to Alaska. So there is but what is more important in this growing world, which is full of social media and knowledge oriented, is to spread more strategic policies for the use of resources but in a very careful manner to ensure more preservance of this region, which is emerging as a more attractive, still a very resource-rich region there. So the Russia's northward expansion seems to be quietly increasing on the Arctic portion of the Russia, which is exploring more and more to boost its economy. And in the years of 89 to 90, the first drill was done in a well in Chukchi Sea, and the production of oil had begun in the year of 2001. And then afterward, 2007 onwards, Russia, as I earlier told, that it has flagged its titanium flag, and all the conflicts started to begin, and all the countries actually neglected this earlier. But then after this stunt which Russia has done, but really it took all the US and other nation countries, their member countries, that how can one actually tag the flag there and very unauthorized way. And actually there is a climate, resources, commerce, all three have made Arctic a subject of global interest. And number of countries are beginning to claim one or other kind of stake in the region. For instance, it seems that ice melting has some bearing on monsoon pattern for India also. A country like China might have political strategic interest in finding a grip in the region as so as to participate in the exploitation of Arctic resources. These types of conditions admittedly had implications for the security and environment and raised complex issues in governing the Arctic. UN clause, the United Convention on the Law of the Sea, has also ratified 1982 to govern the ocean of the world and how the Arctic should govern there in absence of any specific multilateral treaty, unlike the Antarctica, where we have a treaty there. But UN clause wanted it to be a very cooperative way and very lenient way, peaceful way to resolve any conflict there. So there is a growing discussion over whether or not the security environment of Arctic is re-entering a new Cold War. The crux of this argument is Cold War and the era of Arctic exceptionalism is coming to an end, as this era has been understood as a period in which the Arctic region was one in which great power rivalry had already begun in Cold War times. And the reality that there is no new Cold War, as I read in the article, there is no new Cold War which is seeing in recent time, but already the Cold War has delimited themselves, and as US forgot to focus on the Arctic, and Russia had started gaining its importance there, its importance in Arctic. So at the heart of the problem, geographical proximity of the Soviet and American located connected in the Arctic region. So in the begin to challenge each other in the Cold War time international system. Many missiles have tested there, many ballistic missiles have tested their nuclear, and many both US and Russia wanted to gain more and more grip in Arctic in the Cold War time. But as the Cold War time ends and 1990s came, and both the closer to which the US and Russia were able to enumerate the central importance of nuclear weapons came in the 1990s under a member of nuclear weapon reduction agreement, where they both have to reduce on the START 1 and START 2 treaties, and the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Agreement also have done. Both showed that they have ended making the nuclear weapon and all. But while these programs were successful in reducing the number of nuclear weapons and their launch vehicle from the Arctic, they did not void the commitment that both the US and Russia had their core security base on the nuclear deterrent there. So there still was there war there, and likewise the Americans also reduced much of the forces based in Alaska and followed the reduction of their nuclear forces required by START. And Americans also became very distracted by the series of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq following the terrorist attack on their soil in 2001. But at no point did the Americans ever move to renounce or diminish their co-dependence on nuclear deterrence, their as ultimate security policy. What this meant is that throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, the Russian state was too weak to challenge the Americans, and yet the Americans became focused elsewhere, but not the Arctic. But the Arctic remained the core region of their ultimate security defense policy for the deployment of their nuclear weapon deterrence. So I'm not taking much time. And Russia and I both told all the points almost. So therefore, lastly, in last year, two sides have both been expanding their forces in 2019, centered on their deterrent forces and those forces designed to respond to the other side forces. They're reciprocating, like one is making more, and then other is responding to others' side. So given that two sides were quick to return to their Cold War position earlier, it is clear that the hope of the Arctic exceptionalism period never really was based on the improvement of the core difference between the two, but was only the result of Russia exhausted. Like it just wanted to acquire more and more Arctic region. This Arctic never really stopped being the core security geographic location for the two main. And in 2015, it became apparent that this newest phase of the new strategic environment will be different in that the Chinese will become increasingly important in the region. China has also came there, and already self-proclaimed near Arctic nation, China began to deploy surface naval forces in northern waters in 2015 in both Bering Sea and the northern European waters. And if and when Chinese nuclear powered submarine enter ice covered water, the position of both Russia and the US will become much more complicated. While Russia and China has a good relation in Arctic recently, there is no guarantee yet in the future that it will remain the same. It will continue in the future. So regardless for Russia and for the US, the arrival of submarines from the world's second most powerful navy will provide for even more complication in this critically strategic location of the Arctic. So thus, it sounds clear that the Arctic became one of the most important strategic locations as soon as the US and Russia became dominant in the international system. So I'm concluding here. Now, nowadays, every country are in big rush, and in the current scenario in COVID-19 pandemic which occurred, and no one knows about this situation that it will happen. Recently, which US was not so prepared, was not so focused on the Arctic. It first, I think it's recently make a very big decision that US defense allocations showed just how concerned US leader, as I read in one report, have become regarding Chinese activity in relations in the Arctic security. US Senate Bill 1790, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020, recently on this August 2020, allocates $738 billion to national defense and clearly reflects the US focus to enhancing defense capabilities in the Arctic. So now they are showing how they focus, how they are very much concerned about this region. And it details the process to report on Chinese and Russian military activities in the Arctic and evaluate the extent to which these activities affect or threaten the interests of the US and its allies. So the US defense personnel are also closely monitor these Chinese FDI in this region. So later I will focus on this issue later on, but these are the main points which I have discussed since the main issues and then the Cold War era, and then how they are again making a new Cold War scenario there in the Arctic, and how China is emerging there. And on concluding remarks, I will say that the Arctic is basically a major geographically resourceful region which is slowly coming under the politics of the nation for their own national interests. Later, this region may have a probability of coming under some conflict due to its energy resources, for which Arctic nations are eagerly trying to conquer more and more sea land, which is for now with Russia, major portion. So for other remaining nations have some claims are giving their best to ensure that what they have will now not be taken will and will gain more maritime claims in future time. So in the process of claiming and engaging in the conflict over resources, there should not be a situation like all we end up with nothing other than the no Arctic land. So which will even worse for this planet and for the coming generation in the future. So there is a great rivalry, power rivalry in the region, and competition is getting intense due to the natural resources and the new emerging trade routes. As the territorial claims are increasing for resources and trying to claim these water bodies for their own benefits, there is no doubt that there will be a new conflict in the coming future too. So thank you for the patient listening. I will take a break here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Preeta Varma. So we have two more presenters. So now the fourth presenter is Ms. Amal Anjari. She is a student of Stella Maris College, and her presentation title is redefining traditional and non-traditional security threats in a post-COVID-19 world order. So I understand that it's a big canvas and in fact encompassing all the security issues. So I think it's a challenging task for the presenter, but I believe that she'll do justice to her presentation title. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kabir, for that introduction. So I would like to begin by thanking NICE and the Water Policy Center for giving me this opportunity to present my paper. I do have a slide, so I guess I'll be sharing my screen.
Please.
All right, so my topic is redefining traditional and non-traditional security threats in a post-COVID-19 world order. I think before we jump into redefining security, it's important that we look into some of the established definitions of security. And trust me, a lot of people have given a tremendous amount of definitions out there. So international security, also known as global security, is a term which refers to the measures taken by states and international organizations, such as the UN or the EU, and others to ensure mutual survival and safety. So these measures include military action and diplomatic agreements such as treaties and conventions, and international and national security are invariably linked. And international security is national security or state security in the global arena. So one of the definitions that I resonate with, and especially which I think, truly defines the 2020, dilemma we are in, is one given by political scientist Roland Paris, where he defines international security as one whose meaning lies in the eyes of the beholder, and or more like someone who's experiencing all the crisis right now. So traditional approaches to international security usually focus on state actors and their military capacities to protect national security. So a very realist, anarchical view of the global system. However, over the last decades, the definition of security has been extended to cope with the 21st century globalized international community, its rapid technological developments and global threats that emerged from this process. And one such comprehensive definition has been proposed by Naif Al-Rodan, which he calls the multi-sum security principle. So it is based on the assumption that in a globalized world, security can no longer be thought of as a zero-sum game involving states alone. So the present global crisis has been both unfortunate and unprecedented. Apart from wreaking havoc all across the globe, the COVID pandemic has exposed several other security risks that nation states will be subjected to, and the first and the most important being health security. Inability to develop safe vaccines to combat the spread of the virus has compelled people to accept disease and death as a new reality. And that health is no longer confined within domestic borders has been a lesson in the wake of this pandemic. And another non-traditional security aspect that the COVID has highlighted is the severe economic repercussions on the global order. The world is moving through a period of negative growth, and something which we have not seen in the past few years. And in fact, the Global Economic Prospects paper published by World Bank on June 2020 states that the emerging markets in the developing countries are the most vulnerable to this financial crisis, and nearly 60 million people are expected to be pushed into extreme poverty in a post-COVID world. I mean, if that's not scary, I don't know what is. And moreover, COVID-19 is set to increase political instability in countries such as Japan, South Korea, India, China, and the US, mainly due to, again, the economic repercussions of the lockdown, and also due to the public reaction to governmental policy in efforts towards eradicating the virus. Even before the pandemic started, we have been seeing a rise in right-wing populist leaders. And now the question is how long these right-wing leaders are going to hide behind the threat of a pandemic. So the COVID-19 pandemic has increased our dependence on cyberspace clearly. The Zoom meetings and reliance our reliance on Skype and Google Meet and all these other applications. And there have already been reports which suggest that the security of these platforms has been breached. So this calls for a close inspection and proper securitization of the features to ensure that data is protected. And alongside these, the defense industry is set to experience a major slowdown due to the pandemic. So production, manufacturing facilities, and supply chains could be affected as the requirements shift towards civilian and police equipment from heavy military equipment. And more importance will be given to recovery and aid systems than weapons and ordnance. So this crisis, again, will have a profound geopolitical consequences. I mean, the academic circle in IR is talking about the global order, the rise of China, and what the post-COVID-19 world order is going to be like. So I think it's important that we do look into the geopolitical consequences of this as well. So it is evident from the aforementioned instances that COVID-19 is in fact a non-traditional security threat in more ways than one. And it leads to multitudes of security concerns that encompass most major domains of politics, including the economy and cyberspace. Securitization and protection services are of paramount importance in the same regard. So this price of ignorance in terms of human security is now paid with 20% decrease in the global economy, mainly due to worldwide lockdowns and quarantines. And there's a staggering fact that more than 800,000 deaths have occurred across the globe. And, we're still counting, mainly due to the lack of medical facilities. And also we should be looking into the economic vulnerability of states to handle such threats for a prolonged period of time. So the virus teaches us that the hierarchy of global security threats is changing rapidly, and we're dealing with radically new enemies. And that calls for a fundamental change in our security priorities. So former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, in his book Perestroika, cautioned at the height of the Cold War that the new political outlook calls for recognition of one simple axiom: security is indivisible. It is either equal security for all or none at all. And so while the primary focus at that time was nuclear weapons and to a certain extent terrorism, the Gorbachev axiom rings true today in a loud and clear manner with respect to the current global health crisis. So the coronavirus crisis again has exposed the weakness of multilateralism once again. International cooperation has been the weakest when the crisis has been raging. Most countries are on their own, and the UNSC could not even discuss the crisis, while the World Health Organization has been mired in controversies. And if you look into the G20 countries, they did not come up with anything worthwhile, or did they come up with any unified initiative? And the WTO, as we all know, has been in deep crisis for the last many years. And the IMF's assessment that the global economy has gone into recession has again created a huge panic. So the world needs a global plan to save jobs and shore up these beleaguered sectors of the economy and address the livelihood issues of the poorest and most vulnerable sections. There is nothing like that in the offering right now, and not even any discussions as such. So many countries have approached the IMF for emergency lending, and again, this would again break the economies of many countries. This could lead to widespread unrest and instability. So it is interesting to note that pandemics have always been recognized as one of the non-traditional security threats, but palpably never regarded as a likely or serious one. And this is where I would like to quote Dwight D. Eisenhower when he stated that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. The reason it is important to plan is to keep yourself steeped in the character. Sorry. Steeped in the character of the plan you may one day be called to solve. So I think even though we can't talk about a planning stage now for COVID-19, I think it's still important that the community as such, the international community as such, come up with a global comprehensive security review, or is something I would like to call it. So let's say it can be taken up by the United Nations or the UNSC, whereby which it would pave the way for an optimal blueprint for fighting global security challenges such as pandemics and environmental concerns in the near future, and agree on a global security paradigm and create comprehensive national security as well as regional cooperation. So the Chinese language expresses the word crisis as YG, denoting a state of both danger and opportunity. So just as a crisis carries risks along with it, it is also accompanied by opportunities. And when the storm passes and the dust settles, whether the new world will emerge stronger and the post-COVID-19 normal, more resilient and sustainable, will hinge on our ability to effectively mitigate these risks while harnessing the opportunities that these social psychological effects may present. So broader participation in global security efforts will also increasingly dissolve the boundary between domestic and international affairs and policy. And these shifts will in turn create opportunities for a vastly more diverse range of people to sit at the table on global security issues. And the final piece of the puzzle is how to provide global security. But again, the deep nature of global threats means that they can be reduced but almost never eliminated. Arming people with the means to recognize and avoid danger, survive trauma, and adapting to new circumstances is a better long-term strategy. So I think the world calls for a strategy that is fundamentally oriented around human well-being, and which refocuses on global cooperation and regional integration. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you are just on time. So, and a lot of issues came, but there are issues that you could cover. So I'll be coming on this later on. So now we have the last speaker, a very distinguished professor of Northeastern Hill University, Dr. Biswajit Mohapatra, and he's a very good speaker. So and in fact, assigning only 15 minutes would be an injustice. But I think he knows that we have a time limit. So now you have the floor, Dr. Mahapatra.
Yeah, Dr. Mahfouz Kabir, our distinguished friend from Bangladesh, Pramod Jaiswal, the chief organizer of NICE. And it's an occasion like this that one is not really, one doesn't really feel happy to refuse and also doesn't feel quite happy to not to join. I had a little problem in the earlier session simply because that I didn't get connected from Shillong. Anyway, greetings from Northeastern University Shillong. It's a beautiful place. It's a great university. It's a place of learning and also a place of great tourism. I think, I was given a topic to talk about global governance and global institutions. And we need to know as to how the world is feeling a little excited about the kind of standardization that is coming up in the context of global governance, and how the world is also crying for the establishment of those standards even in the poorer countries, where they feel that they will lead to the elevation of their suffering and also improvement of various socio-economic infrastructures which do really add in the context of gaining prosperity. When you talk about middle class, we all understand that today's globalization has created a lot of desire particularly in everyone, particularly in the youth, in order to become prosperous and also fashionable. And we all know fashionable comes out with the prosperity, and prosperity is the result of a kind of good governance which we tend to experience in our day-to-day life within our own country and more particularly within our own political system. Whenever we talk of global governance, we have to understand that global governance has come up as a consequence of the globalization process, which is going on in the last 20 years. Although globalization is nothing new, but nonetheless, globalization tends to have resulted in creating a kind of a middle class, which can be said to be truly globalized middle class. And the desire for good governance or global governance tends to come up from that section of the society, which is entirely, although we call it politically, euphemistically elitist, but nonetheless they are a global middle class, which tends to look for the kind of services, the kind of system, the kind of systemic benefits which are there in the advanced society to be replicated in our own poorer developing countries, that is in the south. And when you talk of globalization, we also have to understand that globalization tends to be a product of technology. Although it stands for integration of the national market, it tends to also stand for creation of unity in the human mind. And the creation of human mind tends to give rise to the establishment of a new kind of a political system, which will be more accountable, which will be more transparent, which will also be more just in the long time, in the long duration, rather than what it appears to be in the earlier days of globalization in any particular country. And we all understand that this rapid globalization process which is going on in the world today, although we talk of COVID, we'll come to that as to whether globalization tends to be responsible for the global spread of the COVID-19, as we see in all the countries of the world today. But nonetheless, since we have to talk about globalization and global governance, we need to understand that Rosino tends to have said that the need for global governance tends to have arose, particularly in the context of the need of regulating the interdependent relations that we share in our own society, in the absence of an overarching political system which tends to be lacking in the world today. And that is in the absence of an international system. And the reason being that without emphasizing on the idea of justice and its realization, the whole globalization process seems to be coming apart in a very tearing fashion. And if the globalization tends to have become unstoppable, tends to have become inevitable, the idea is to bring about the changes in the system where everyone could be made a participant of the globalization process and also a beneficiary, rather than being kept aside or left behind as globalization tends to be resulting in the earlier days in any kind of a society. Adil Nazam tends to, according to Adil Nazam, global governance tends to stand for management of global processes in the absence of a global government. So the search is for a global government, and global government, since it cannot be there, since it could be acquiring an autocratic, a kind of a very statist fashion, it is better to go for a global governance which will lay down for a standardization of the global governance processes in each of our political system that is present in our own societies. We also have to understand that whenever we talk about global governance and whether it is good or bad, we need to compare it with our own contemporary society, the present day times that we are living in, including the COVID time, we find that the present day human, political, socio-economic relations tend to have become very, very complex, including the whole governance system. When you talk of the present day times, we find that the government seem to be looking for ways and means as to how to come to a grip of this problem. And we know how the so-called failure of the government tends to have resulted in elimination of more and more people in a warlike fashion than what would have been the result if the government would have been had a standardization procedure, or what you call it in the popular terms SOP in place, where probably the losses could have been less than what it is today. So when we tend to find that the human social relations, everything has gone for a topsy-turvy, has become very, very complex, and we find that there seems to be a kind of a sense of hopelessness. When the national governance tends to have created sense of hopelessness, the idea is that people tend to look for some kind of, as you call it, some kind of a external power or external force, which probably could take them out of the morass of the present day living and promise them all and ensure all the benefits that they deserve to be called a properly dignified human living being on this earth today. So that this kind of a desire tends to look for some kind of a ethical governance, which tends to be lacking in the so-called political governance that is obtained in our respective countries. And when we talk of today governance, we tend to know that the governance tend to be rather very complicated, rather tend to be very corrupt, rather tend to be very weak, and rather also tend to be unresponsive, nonetheless not accountable to the people on whose behalf the government seems to be in place. So that tends to lead to a desire for an ethical consideration, which is thought that if the governance process is imbued by some kind of ethical considerations or ethical characteristics, probably the governance would result in a kind of a good governance, which is coming up from the so-called box of a global governance. And we find that we also need to understand that in the present times, we tend to confuse the governance merely with the task of meeting our day-to-day needs, prevention of human conflicts, and the resolution. And in the process, human conditions tend to become very, very worse. So governance tend to be looked at in a much broader fashion than what we tend to look at it in its own immediate context. And the present intergovernmental institution that tends to have come into place in the context of the demand and realization of the good global governance that is coming up from the international institutions, we need to understand that they seem to have become some kind of a transformed role of the intermediate institutions, which are the result of the so-called interwar period. So the desire is to probably have a transformation process of these political institutions, which will certainly result in a good governance, besides they being global in character. And hence the international community tends to feel that since globalization process has become unstoppable, since it is something which cannot be done without it, since it has gone too far, although it has created a backlash of people, backlash amongst the poorer classes in the society, the idea is to come up with other mechanisms which will probably strengthen the globalization process and also makes everyone a partner in the process. So over the years, we find that intergovernmental institutions in the world over tend to have also acquired some kind of a transformatory role, which tends to have resulted in some kind of a, what we call it within quote, better governance. When you look into the world institution today, we find that United Nations Security Council probably can stand up as a very important institution, which tends to have resolved more conflicts and have also let down the standard of governance in many of its own member countries. And when we talk of Security Council, we know how Security Council tends to ensure good governance. We have a concept of failed state, failure state, collapse state, but those things have been rather mitigated simply because the UN Security Council tends to be playing a rather very activist role in any kind of a problematic or conflictual situation. We know that how UN Security Council by its own resolutions have tend to have dealt with the so-called authoritarian governments, tends to have dealt with the crimes against humanity by setting up various international tribunals. It has also tend to have imposed sanctions on various economic and trade issues of the rogue countries, as we tend to call, and it has also tend to have come to grip on the issue of Iraq, on the issue of North Korea, and also it has also launched a trial of it has also tried various ex-autocrats who tend to have been punished for their action. And not only United Nations Security Council tends to play an active role as a global institution, we also find that the World Bank tends to have also provided a lot of economic and technological support to the various member countries in order to establish the good governance system in place, which can be which is comparable with that of the global governance system as it is found in the so-called advanced countries of the West. We also know that how International Development Agency tends to be providing soft loans to the member countries, and that is not really to enrich the elitist class, rather to meet with the demands for development in the grassroots level, as we say, in the poorer countries. We also know how the kind of infrastructural changes that we see in India or in any of the poorer countries today. When you go to Sri Lanka, you find the roads are almost comparable to the road that is found in the West, or in China. That is because it is made with the advanced technology and also with huge capital. So World Bank tends to, to make the human life more living, more enriching, more dignified. It tends to emphasize in the context of the global governance how the infrastructural level needs to be up, how the road networks would be more strengthened, how improvement of people's livelihood tends to be more important, how land reforms has to be also has to be made a part of the so-called policy making process, and how agriculture productivity and also the food security are important. We know that all these things that we are able to realize in our own society simply because there is an emphasis by the so-called global institutions on the concept of global governance. We also know how WTO seems to have made life easy, although the third world countries or the developing countries might be the critic of the WTO process, but nonetheless we know that how the so-called development tends to have a long-term benefit than what normally the left sections tend to feel, that is going to probably result in the dispossessed class. So the predatory globalization tends to have brought the developed and the developing countries seems to be at an equal level. So there we find there is more or less an equality in terms of the governance, although when you compare the today's level of governance with the past level, with the past institutions, with the history, we find that the institutions tend to have become more transparent, tend to have become more accountable, tends to have also become more united in meeting the needs of the people rather than keeping them aside. Today also we know that all the pro-globalization supporters tend to feel that the developments tend to have resulted in no tangible improvement to the life of the people. We find the global governance tends to have met the needs of the people and also has come up with new challenges. But these new challenges can only be met only when the so-called governance system in the developing countries, in the poorer countries of the South, would be able to cope up with the pressure that is coming up from the global institutions and improvise their own system in order to be able to meet the needs of their own population. So here we find that the United Nations MDG Million Development Goals, which was again a global kind of intervention, tends to have also resulted in the improvement of our own life and standard of living in the respective countries. Although we know that even MDG could not meet the target which was set for it, but nonetheless, whatever has been achieved is certainly better than not having any kind of a achievement in terms of the identified goals in our respective countries. So here we find that while United Nations tends to be very active in the global forum, while World Bank and other institutions tend to have also joined United Nations in emphasizing on the kind of establishment and incorporation of the global governance standards, we find that the net result of it has been the strengthening of what we call it democracy. We know how in the past people used to vote in others' name. Today, it's not possible simply because that there is a great intervention of technology. So technology, while it has become an intervener, it also has become a kind of a balancer. We also find that this kind of global governance, which is being engaged by the global institution, tends to have also led to the enhancement of the role of the so-called civil society organizations. And we know how civil society organizations tend to have become very active, aided by the technology, where they are able to intervene in the so-called, in any kind of a conflict that may be resulting out of the so-called national governance system. We also find that there has been, it has also contributed towards the proper working of the democratic institutions. Today we know that how the government tends to be emphasizing more on the delivery mechanism rather than merely on what we call a dude mechanism, where they used to only say things and not implement it. And we also find that this has also resulted in making the so-called democratic institutions transparent, accountable, and also overall more productive, as we see in our own daily life. And whenever you talk of, when we talk of the further challenger, and then with the United Nations and the global governance system, the sustainable development, we find that how the countries are now living the development model, which is more carbon oriented rather than they're opting for some kind of a carbon free development model, which tends to be known as a green model, which we find that with the incorporation of the green model of development in our own perspective, probably we will have more of climatic changes that our neighboring country tends to face, and also will save people from any kind of a devastative effect that we are subjected to. And we know that at the end, since there is no time, globalization is a big concept. Global governance, we can go into little more detail in terms of data as to how it has been helpful and how it has been helpless. But nonetheless, we need to remember that the globalization and the global governance process tends to have created a kind of awareness in each of the development community, including the practitioners and the policymakers and virtually the participants, that there is a need to focus on to have a multifaceted approach. If at all, we have to qualify ourselves to be known as a living human society. And we know more of it when you talk of COVID. We find that everywhere it's like a date. You find that when you talk of India, we find that it has been very easy for the Indian society to get rid of something like 80,000 of the people, to be killed in a peaceful manner rather than to be helped to survive, which could have been the result had there been a kind of a standardized governance model. But nonetheless, since it has created an awareness of a multifaceted approach, which needs to be incorporated into our own governance system, which could consist of micro and macro management interventions by the government, which could also lead to quality and quantity of employment, which could also result in the quantity and quality of what you call it economic growth, and it will also lead to, and it will also it has also created a need for strengthening of the so-called national architecture for public service delivery mechanism that we have in place. And we also have to remember that while if governance has become unstoppable, as global governance has become inevitable, simply because that countries are tied up with the developed countries, with the international organizations by virtue of their monetary and technical support that they tend to receive in terms of their promised benefits. We find that since technological change tends to play a disruptive role, we also, the whole human society needs to be ready in order to be able to create much more opportunities for our own people through what we call it through use of the technology more and more, and to strengthen our own democratic governance process, which will result in a transparent, accountable, and as I said before, in a more productive political system, so to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we have finished all the presentations. So, in fact, I have a formula. So it's 2 minutes each for each of the presenters, and we don't have any questions or comments except Mr. Ladu Chaudhary. So the question is to Mr. Chaudhary, and then I mean it's a kind of freestyle, in fact, response by the other speakers. So the question is from Professor Biswajit Mohapatra, and it's given the fact that COVID-19 is having quite unsettling effects on the nation's understanding and their exercise of power. So and can the nation be in fact any more successful in acquiring of power in the post-COVID days for ensuring their security? So that is the question. And if you have any other, in fact, issues that you want to flag, so Professor Ladu Chaudhary.
Yes, thank you. It's really a very nice question. Dr. Biswajit has asked to me. I would like to say the question in this uncertain time is not about how to acquire power. The question is, the bigger question is that what constitutes power in the contemporary context? What would be the key element of power? When we prioritize, put the list of preferences in terms of elements of power, that list has already changed. Earlier in the conventional understanding, traditionally security perspective, military was the first preference in terms of element of national power. now I think the hierarchy has changed. I'm not saying that military has become irrelevant. What I'm saying that the kind of contemporary threat we have is COVID. So what kind of capabilities nations have at their disposal to counter? And in what domain? So the target is already invisible. The enemy is invisible. The application of that power which this nation has is very difficult. And even if some has a power to counter that enemy, so to what? To do what? Whether they want to kill the enemy, that's impossible. So they are just having power to counter or contain the enemy. But containment at what scale? Because that immediate threat the international community is facing is spread of virus. Its scope is very wider. And then the power that nation has, how they will exercise it, by what means they will exercise to counter the COVID, and under what circumstances. So these are the, I think, critical questions every nation is facing. So the question that acquiring the power in this uncertain time, I think if a policy prescription framework is focused on these parameters, then we will be able to get a clear picture of understanding of power for a state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Ms. Sayam Muktan. Miss Sayam Muktan, you want to say something? Okay, then Miss Vinita Verma. Yes, please.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Vinita, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Hello.
Yes.
Am I
Please,
audible?
please go ahead.
Can you repeat the question?
So there is no question. I mean, you have 2 minutes to uncover issues.
Okay, okay, okay. So firstly, I will thanks all my co-panelists, Laddu Ram Chaudhary sir, Sayam Muktam, and Amal Ansari, and our co-chair, Dr. Mahfouz Kabir. So as the Vishwajit Mohapatra sir has discussed about the globalization, and as I note down the global governance and social economic relations, so related to ethical governance, and all are interconnected. So how the civil society organization are resulting in national governance system, sustainable development, and all are related. So he correctly mentioned the globalization as coming future. In coming future is going to be a technology one, for sure. It's going to be a technology firstly, but as I yesterday, as I listened to one of the panelists, as Dr. Amit Gupta, in one of the sessions, has uh, in discuss as how he mentioned about the globalization is going to be the globalization of ideas, and he clearly mentioned about the ideas, how it's going to affect the next 50 years, the generation of the society, and how the government and governance is all going to follow the political ideas of the future. So these all are interconnected, and as my topic is uh, connected to the great powers and politics, so how they are taking advantage of the small region which is coming to Arctic natural resources, and how it's going to be impacting the all over the world, and how it's going to shape the world in the coming future. And there is definitely many pundits had said that it's going to be international arena conflict of power. Obviously it's going to be a conflict of power. So the globalization is going to be firstly the ideas, as I mentioned, and the second will be the who have the more resources, who have the more resources with themselves to satisfy their own needs and the needs of the society, and how they will export the resources after fulfilling their own country's national interests, and all of the aspects, and how they are going to impact the situation, and health. Thirdly, the health, and who is going to be master of the health ministry, we can say. But yeah, health is going to be a main concept there. How, but as we can say that now vaccine, whenever the COVID-19 vaccine will come, it's not going to be supplied freely to the market, every country. But for sure, it's going to take time, and how effectively, how fast the countries will beneficial the other countries, and after taking advantage, and how they are going to freely invest in their economy also, and how they will sustain their economy after 4 5 years. And this is going to be a more power game than any others. Thank you. Hope you all like it.
Then Ms. Amal Anjari.
Am I audible?
Yes, please.
I think there again, talking about security and all the security dilemmas that we face, I think there is an urgent need to, look at the security issues that we are facing at the moment. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of speculations going on about, a lot of the trajectories of security issues, but I think it's important that we address the issues we are facing right now, like the economic repercussions, and again, the human security of it all. And at the end of the day, I think it's important that countries cooperate rather than, go to the again, that post Cold War era of, trying to get on top, or, get the hegemonic power. I don't think, that's a viable conception anymore. I think it's important that, it's less about winning and more about withstanding, in my opinion. And I think that's something that countries should be looking into. Thank you.
So the last minute for Dr. Vishwajit Mohapatra. Last 2 minutes.
I think I will thank the organizer for organizing such an international seminar of great importance, and on an important topic called post-pandemic world order. But when we talk of the topic, we need to understand that the post-pandemic world order is not going to be a kind of a blessing for the so-called countries of the South. Although the pandemic has given rise to questions with regard to globalization, and that's why people say that we probably will have to rethink globalization. But nonetheless, we need to remember that the way globalization process is a Western neoliberal project is not going to stop at all. It's going to be probably, with this brief pause due to pandemic, it's going to be probably followed in a much more virulent and much more stronger manner, which will probably will sweep us all into one direction, which certainly, while it may lead to global governance, we need to also understand that the post-pandemic world order probably will also, in the few years of its post-COVID-19 period, will probably result in a widening inequality between the sections of the society, and probably will create many more social problems than the economic benefit. So if we exercise the caution, if we exercise some kind of a proper understanding on the consequences, probably we'll be able to build a better society, which will be, as we call it, which will be full of within court justice and probably the human values. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers. I mean, they covered a lot of issues regarding the security and the traditional and non-traditional security issues. The era of COVID-19. So I noted down a lot of points, but it's not possible to cover all these issues. But I'll try to pick some of the important issues from the notes and from all the speakers, and definitely the first speaker, Professor Choudhury. I mean, he said and he discussed about the power. In fact, status of power dynamics in different parts of the world, and in the role of big powers, and what would be the new definition of power and exercise of power. And he in fact cited some of the important works of in fact scholars like Joseph Nye and others, and definitely it's an enlightening presentation. And he in fact mentioned about the hard power, soft power, and smart power, and definitely all the powers have the role, and it depends on the in fact player which is exercising the different kind of power, and in the admixture of powers. And definitely, I mean, the power is in the disequilibrium. There is a huge, in fact, massive disruption of the power. In fact, the pre-COVID is, the comparing the pre-COVID situation, and definitely we are looking forward to, in fact, seeing the exercise of power of the great powers and the emerging powers. And definitely there will be a change, but what would be the direction of the change, that we will have to be waiting and watching. So that is the thing. And power as identity, definitely there are powers, definitely they're ambitious, and powers in the world, they're forthcoming, but in fact now we have the new identity and new politics, like the politics with the vaccine. So they're all the great powers, they're in the competition of vaccination, and there's a new in fact diplomacy which is called in fact vaccine diplomacy. So there are a lot of new terminologies are coming, and in the in fact countries who are exercising the power, so they are in fact exercising the different kind of notion of power. So very interesting to see. So, and definitely the balance of our body would be the new balance in the post-COVID era. So can we imagine right now, and what are the new directions, new dynamics? So that these are the things that we will have to be discussing in the course of time. And then Ms. Saim Mokhtar, and she has the presentation on migration and demography. So there are in fact new issues and new dynamics in the migrations. If we see the traditional, in fact, push-pull factors in the discourse of migration, and there are definitely the forced migration in some cases, and if we see the other issues of migrations, like the environmental migration, the climate refugees, so and in fact eviction. So there are a lot of in fact dynamics. But if we consider the case of economic migration, so if we see the in and out migration, the push-pull factors, so these are in fact getting the new definitions, new perspectives. And now if we see the Todaro-Harris in fact model, so now it's not working. So the urban areas and city centers, they are on huge, the tremendous pressure. So there is a new kind of, in fact, reverse migration. So people are going from city to the village areas, the areas that are not the economic centers. So, and there is a new pressure on the underdeveloped and traditional areas. So, and definitely, so there are new issues in the case of migration dynamics. And she has rightly mentioned it's women, children, and I would like to say that there are other groups of the population, like the persons with disability. So that is the issue, and people living in the vulnerable and marginal areas. So people living in the in fact, like the islands, riverine islands, and in fact coastal islands. So they are facing new challenges. So we have the vulnerability, we had the vulnerability, but the vulnerabilities are in fact increasing, so intensifying. So and there is a in fact disproportionate impact, incidence and impact on the different groups of people who are migrating. So migration is an process, the ongoing process, but I mean, then we are seeing a new direction of migration. So very nice presentation, and an important issue that was not covered, but I think I mean, if Sai Mokhtar, she can consider it. It's called multidimensional poverty. Now the report has been published, so it's a 2020 multidimensional poverty report, and if if you see the different dimensions of poverty beyond income, so there is a in fact consequence of this kind of the new dynamics of migration on the multidimensional poverty, and definitely on the sustainable development goals. And the next presentation was on the issue of Arctic. So definitely it's a new dimension of discussion, the discourse, and these are the issue that was in fact discussed, but not the in the main discourse. So now it's coming, and definitely the issue is how to grab, how to extract more, in fact, natural resources like oil and gas. I mean, that basically the minerals, the petrochemicals. So these are the issue, but there is a kind of in fact concern on the security, definitely the traditional security arena, and there are a few countries like the Russian Federation and the USA, there is a Canada, Greenland, and some other in fact countries which are located surrounding the Arctic area. So and if we see the broad canvas of the security architecture, so there is a in fact concern of traditional security, like I mean the military threats and in fact armament and military conflicts. So there are in fact concerns, even though there is another concern, and which is covered by the presenter, which is called I mean the climate change, the issue of climate change. So it's already going on. If you see the carbon emissions, so it's in fact it has not decreased during the period of COVID. So even though we are expecting that the total carbon, I mean the additional carbon emission would be decreased because of lesser transportation, lesser in fact production, but still if we see the in fact reports, different reports, so carbon is increasing. So it's not that I mean the world community is going to see a significant change in the discourse of climate change. So now the issue is the Arctic, so the exploration of oil and gas. So it's going to be produce two different sets of challenges. One is traditional security threat, so it's going to be a rivalry between the great powers, I mean among the great powers, and also the global climate change. So these are the two issues, and there are other in fact repercussions, international repercussions. So and the fourth presentation is on in fact, so it's in fact traditional and non-traditional security issues, and there are in fact issues of WTO, in fact development, IMF, and many others like World Bank, ADB, and different indicators of traditional and non-traditional security issues have been discussed in this piece of presentation. But if you see, I mean, according to Amal Anjari's presentation, so it's something like economic vulnerability, economic. So there are a lot of issues that are coming in the context, but economic vulnerability, political, cyber, and supply chain, geopolitical. So these are whole list of security issues that are being discussed, and it will in fact experience changes in the coming years. And very interestingly, if you see the global institutions like World Bank, ADB, in fact the regional organizations is called ADB, and definitely IMF, so they are coming with the new packages. So it's a bailout packages for the countries. But the thing is that if you see the requirements, all the countries require funding. So there is a competition kind of thing, and the global institutions are unable to, in fact, disburse the money and money that are being required by the countries which need it the most. So that is a big challenge, and there is a question of parity of distribution of funding, and definitely there is a new kind of requirement, like I mean the period that the loan would be repaid and the terms and conditions. Traditionally, the international organizations like World Bank, IMF, and ADB, they have the, in fact, kind of requirement of repayment. So it's called conditionality. So they have to, in fact, reset the conditionality, the terms and conditions, and there might be new discourse regarding the, in fact, revival of the global economy, from the in fact decision, so looming decision. So that's a big challenge for the international institutions to in fact undertake the recovery measures. So there's a challenge of human security and economic security. So definitely it's a big concern for all of us. And regarding the final presentation, so it's regarding the global governance and global institutions. So it's going to be, even though Dr. Vishwajit Mohapatra, he has discussed a lot regarding the role of the institutions and global governance. And if you see the in fact directions, even though the book was written in 2000, published in 2019, it's Amitabh Acharya and Barry Buzan, a celebrated book on the in fact global institutions. So, but still, I mean, there are in fact relevance of their in fact suggestions. So, and globalization. So, if you see the role of the WTO and its ongoing globalization, so now we have a new definition of globalization. Globalization is global pandemic. So now we see we experience the global, in fact, the term globalization. So now we are in fact all the countries are affected, so and they are sharing the similar kind of pain. So now we understand the meaning, the positive side of globalization and negative side. So that is the reality. And now there's a big challenge for the global institutions, that like even, I mean, United Nations, different organs of the United Nations, like, I mean, the economic and in fact, so there are, I mean, the definitely Security Council has a in fact they have the agenda, and there are other developmental and social in fact organs of the UN. So they cover the things, and other institutions, the global institutions, whether they are in fact equally thinking. Definitely WHO, they have the agenda on in fact global, the kind of global pandemic, but whether the other institutions, they are thinking equally. So and also the countries which are in fact struggling to come out of poverty, so the underdeveloped countries, the LDCs and others. So there are many LDCs, like including Bangladesh and others. So they set the in fact timeline of graduating from the LDCs, but now there is a challenge. So and there is an uncertainty regarding the graduations, definitely Nepal and others. So and now what would be the direction, what would be the in fact new timeline of in fact agenda 2030, which is called sustainable development goals. So whether we'll be in fact achieving, will be successful in achieving the SDGs. So and definitely there are other issues like technology transfer, the cyberspace security and other things. And I think there's no end of discussion, but it's good that we covered some of the issues, and there are a lot of new issues that we will be discussing. And uh, all the very best to the presenters. And it's good to see you in this in fact forum. And NIIC, they in fact they have tremendously in fact successful, have been successful in organizing and best utilize the space, I mean the cyberspace, in organizing. And uh, they have demonstrated in over the last 3-4 months uh, that it's an age of opportunity. So we can discuss a lot of issues and in the cyberspace, and definitely we can benefit. So and thank you very much for your presentation, very nice presentation. And definitely we'll be looking forward to see you in the next similar kind of events in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
So, distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we came to the end of this section, it's my great honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE and Water Policy Center. I would like to express our gratitude and senior thank to Mr. Mehfooz Kabir for accepting our request to the chair the section. Our sincere thank goes to all the speakers for delivering such a comprehensive and insightful presentation. We are honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academic, media, and different organizations. Last but not the least, I must mention a deep sense of appreciation for our audience who has participated in the webinar and those who are watch us live. We are truly honored to have you all with us in this last section and hope you stay connected with future as well. Thank you.